I am Julia, 32 years old, and I never thought the bloodiest battlefield of my life would be an oak-paneled courtroom in Boston, where the man aiming the gun at me is my own father. I stand at attention, hands pressed against my trouser seams, frozen as my father's lawyer reads a death sentence for my character. On the projector screen are grainy photos of me wearing a frayed apron, hunched over, wiping a spilled puddle of coffee off a diner floor. Your Honor, she is just a low-wage waitress. How can she have the capacity to manage millions of dollars? My father leans back in his leather chair, a smug smirk on his face. He is soaking in the room's mockery, certain he is about to snatch every cent of that $11 million inheritance from my hands. They think that stained apron is the sum of my life. They have no idea what I am wearing underneath. Tell me where you are watching from in the comments. Subscribe if you have ever been dragged into the mud by your own blood because of greed. This story is how I burned them all down. The air in the courtroom smelled like stale oak and the heavy, cheap perfume of the bored neighbors sitting in the back. Judge Miller didn't look like a dispenser of justice. He looked like a man who had spent 40 years watching people claw at each other's throats for a piece of a dead man's pie. He leaned his elbows on the bench, his shoulders slumping under the weight of his black robe, his eyes glazed with a fatigue that suggested he'd already made up his mind. He wasn't looking for the truth. He was looking for a reason to go to lunch. I shifted my gaze to the second row. Robert Sutton, the man who shared half my DNA, sat with his legs crossed in a way that screamed unearned confidence. He was wearing a Brooks Brothers suit that I knew damn well was charged to a credit card he had no intention of paying off. Robert was the king of the American middle-class facade. His fingers tapped a rhythmic, steady beat on the arm of his chair. Tap, tap, tap. It was the sound of a man who thought he had the high ground. He didn't even look at me. In the sandbox, that's the first mistake a commander makes, assuming the target is already neutralized. Arthur Vance stood up. He didn't shout. Men like Vance didn't need to. He moved with the practiced ease of a predator who knew the cage was locked. He flicked a switch, and the hum of the projector filled the silence. The screen flickered to life, bathing the room in a cold, artificial glow. The first slide hit me like a physical blow. It was me. My hair was a mess, tucked under a grease-stained cap. I was lugging 2 heavy black trash bags out to the alley behind the diner. My face was tight with exhaustion. The next slide showed me hunched over a table, fingers raw from the winter wind, scraping a handful of oily nickels and dimes into my palm. Tips. The crumbs left behind by people who didn't see me. Vance's voice cut through the hum of the machine, cold and jagged. A waitress pulling $12 shifts cannot manage an $11 million trust. It's a joke, Your Honor. My client's daughter has no financial standing, no foresight. She is, for all intents and purposes, incompetent to handle the Colonel's legacy. A soft, jagged chuckle rippled through the back row. Those were the neighbors who used to wave at Robert over white picket fences while he was busy bleeding his family dry. I didn't blink. I didn't move a muscle. I stood in the position of attention, my thumbs tucked against my index fingers, just the way I was taught at OCS. I felt the rough texture of the calluses on my palms. They weren't from waitressing. They were from 5-mile rucks and high-stakes law books, and a life Robert knew nothing about. Underneath the cheap blouse I bought at a discount mall, the faint scar on my wrist from a jagged piece of shrapnel during a training exercise throbbed in time with my heart. My mind flashed back to a world Vance couldn't comprehend. I remembered being hunched in a concrete bunker, the smell of cordite and dust clogging my throat, leaning my back against men who weren't my brothers by blood, but who would have taken a bullet to keep me breathing. We shared a canteen. We shared a mission. Here, the man who gave me life was paying someone to stalk me, to hide in the shadows and snap photos just to choke the life out of my future. The pain flared in my chest, a hot, searing knot of betrayal, but I forced it down. I swallowed it until it turned into a solid, freezing block of ice in my gut. Cold anger. The kind that makes you see everything in high definition. Judge Miller tapped his pen against the bench. The sound was sharp, like a bone snapping. He looked at me, his lip curling in a way that didn't hide his contempt. Ms. Sutton, he began, his voice dripping with the kind of condescension reserved for the help. Making a latte isn't exactly the same thing as managing a complex investment portfolio. Do you have anything to say for yourself, or should we just conclude this pathetic display of yours right now? Robert's tapping fingers stopped. He leaned forward, his eyes bright with a predator's hunger. He was ready for the kill. He expected me to cry. He expected me to beg. I didn't do either. I looked past the judge, past Vance, and focused entirely on the image on the screen. It was a shot of me wiping down a glass table. My reflection was blurred in the surface, but the floor caught my eye. The sun was streaming through the diner's window, casting long, sharp shadows across the linoleum. I narrowed my eyes. The shadow hit the floor at a precise 45-degree angle. It was the long, low stretch of the morning sun. I scanned the slide before it. The trash bag photo. Morning sun. The photo of me counting pennies. Morning sun. 3 weeks of surveillance. Every single photo Vance had shown the court was taken in a 3-hour window before noon. Every single one. Robert thought he was smart. He thought he'd boxed me in with a narrative of failure. I felt a ghost of a smirk touch the corner of my mouth. Vance hadn't just shown the court my job. He had accidentally shown me his blind spot. Robert and his high-priced lawyer had no idea what I was doing after the sun went down. The game just changed. That light on the projector screen, that jagged 45-degree shadow, it didn't just show a dirty diner floor. It punched a hole straight through the present. It dragged me back 24 years, back to a house that smelled like old paper and cold ash. Back to the day I stopped being a daughter and became a debt. I was 8 years old. I remember the backseat of Robert's car was sticky with spilled soda. My entire life was packed into one canvas suitcase with a broken zipper. I sat there, small and silent, watching the back of his head. He didn't look at me once in the rearview mirror. He was too busy checking his watch, clicking his tongue, acting like he was late for a flight he actually wanted to be on. We pulled up to the Colonel's house, a big, gray Victorian that looked like a fortress. Robert didn't help me out of the car. He just popped the trunk and waited. I hauled that suitcase across the sidewalk, the wheels rattling like gunfire on the pavement. The Colonel stood on the porch. He was 60 then, but he looked like he'd been carved out of granite. He didn't smile. He just watched Robert walk up the steps with his hands shoved deep into his Brooks Brothers slacks. "We need space, Dad," Robert said. He didn't whisper. He didn't care if I heard. "She's a drain, a constant mess. We've got the new firm starting up, and frankly, she's an inconvenience. You keep her, you've got the room." An inconvenience. Like a late fee. Like a bad weather report. Robert didn't kneel down. He didn't say goodbye. He just turned around, walked back to the car, and closed the door. No hug. Just the slam of heavy metal and the smell of exhaust. I stood there, clutching that broken suitcase, watching his taillights disappear into the Boston fog. I didn't cry. I think I knew, even then, that tears were just wasted moisture. The Colonel looked down at me. His face was a map of 31 years of war. He didn't reach for my hand. He just gestured toward the door. 5:30 is first call, Julia," he said. His voice was like gravel under a boot. "The bed gets made with hospital corners. You don't eat until the floor is swept. Inside." Life with the Colonel wasn't a childhood. It was a long-term deployment. 05:30. Wake up. 05:35. Fold the wool blanket until you could bounce a quarter off it. 0600. Breakfast. Oatmeal and black coffee, no sugar. If I sat there staring at the wall, thinking about the father who'd traded me for space, the Colonel would just stand there with his arms crossed. "Crying solved the mission, Sutton," he'd bark. "No, sir," I'd whisper. "Then move out and draw fire. You're building armor. One day you'll thank me for the weight of it." He didn't give me soft words. He gave me a spine. He forged a shield for me so thick that no one, not even the man who threw me away, could ever draw blood again. Fast forward to when I was 16. I was standing behind the heavy velvet curtains of the library, the smell of the Colonel's pipe tobacco thick in the air. Robert was back. He wasn't there for me. He was there for the vault. He'd gone bankrupt. Again. Some tech startup that crashed because he spent more on the launch party than the product. I watched through the crack in the door as he sat on the edge of the leather chair, looking small and frantic. "Dad, come on," Robert pleaded. His voice had that oily, desperate quality. "It's my birthright. Just a slice of the trust. I'm your own flesh and blood. You're going to let me starve while you sit on millions?" The colonel didn't move. He sat behind his desk, the light catching the silver in his hair. He slowly tapped the ash from his pipe into a glass tray. The sound was cold. Final. "Inheritance isn't an automatic right because you share a name, Robert," the colonel said. Each word was a nail in a coffin. "It's a responsibility. It's a trust that you earn by proving you can carry the weight of those who came before you. And you don't have that. You never did." Robert's face went purple. He looked like he wanted to scream, to break something. But he just sat there, teeth clenched, the same greedy look in his eyes that I'm seeing right now across this courtroom. If you've ever been treated like a burden by the people who were supposed to protect you, hit that like button right now. Drop a ready in the comments if you want to see how a burden turns into a commander. I want to hear from the survivors today. The sharp crack of Judge Miller's gavel snapped the air, shattering the memory. I was back in the oak-paneled room. Back in the present. Robert was still there, leaning back in his chair with that same look of unearned entitlement he'd had when he was 16. He thinks the colonel's money is a prize he can just snatch. He thinks because he hired Vance to take some photos of me in a dirty apron, he's won the war. He's still looking at the waitress. He hasn't realized the colonel's inconvenience has been studying his every move for 20 years. I felt the weight of the manila folder under my hand. It was thin. It was yellowed. But inside was the fire the colonel told me to build. I looked at Robert. I didn't see a father. I saw a target. I saw a man who had pulled the pin on a grenade he didn't know how to throw. I leaned forward, my voice a low, steady hum that cut through Vance's stuttering. "Your Honor," I said, "since we're talking about competence and foreseeable patterns, I think it's time we look at the photos the defense didn't take." Arthur Vance didn't give me a second to breathe. He moved toward the bench, his leather shoes clicking against the hardwood with a predatory rhythm. He stopped, turned on his heel, and pointed a long, manicured finger directly at my face. "Ms. Sutton," he began, his voice projecting to the back of the room where the neighbors sat leaning forward. "Let's talk about reality. You are 32 years old. You work a dead-end job in a greasy diner for $12 an hour. Does that sound like a woman with ambition? Does that sound like someone with the judgment to oversee an $11 million estate?" Vance paused, letting the weight of the number hang in the stale air. He shook his head with a patronizing sigh. "If this court hands that legacy to her, it will vanish. It will evaporate into the same kind of poor, short-sighted decisions she's made with her own life. She is a waitress, Your Honor. Not a trustee." He turned back to his seat, catching my father's eye. Robert gave a slow, triumphant nod. The neighbors whispered, a dry sound like dead leaves skittering on pavement. I felt a twitch at the corner of my mouth. Ambition. Vance wouldn't know ambition if it hit him like a freight train. In his world, success was a birthright handed out in country club locker rooms. In my world, success was something you clawed out of the dirt with your fingernails. My mind slipped back to my early 20s. I saw the fluorescent hum of a law school library at 3 a.m. I felt the stinging smell of ammonia from the industrial mop bucket. While Robert was clinking champagne flutes at charity galas, charging $1,000 suits to credit cards he'd never pay off, I was scrubbing toilets in a downtown office building. I did it for 4 years. Every cent went into a tuition fund that Robert had refused to touch. I remembered the OCS barracks, the smell of wet wool, floor wax, and desperation. I remembered the taste of mud in my lungs during the final rucks, the kind of thick gray silt that clogs your throat until you think you'll never breathe clean air again. My boots were soaked with a mixture of swamp water and the blood from the blisters on my heels, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Every muscle in my body screamed, but the colonel's voice was louder. Move out and draw fire. Everything I had was bought with sweat and the kind of deep, throbbing aches that take up residence in your bones. While my father traded his BMW every 3 years on a revolving line of credit, I was eating cold ramen in a barracks room, staring at law books until the words blurred into gray static. I built a life out of iron and discipline while he was busy burning his down to the ash. The humming of the projector fan grew louder in the silence of the courtroom. I took a breath. A long, slow, deliberate inhale that filled my lungs. I watched the digital clock on the wall. I focused on the rhythm of my heart. I forced it down. 60 beats per minute. Steady, combat effective. I didn't look at Vance. I didn't look at my father. I didn't need a lawyer to speak for me. I took one step forward. It was a measured movement, my spine straight, my shoulders square. I stopped directly in front of Judge Miller's bench. "Your Honor," I said. My voice was low, thick with a weight that seemed to anchor the room. There was no tremor, no hesitation. It was the voice of an officer delivering a sit-rep under fire. "May I address the court's concerns regarding my judgment and my career choices?" Judge Miller narrowed his eyes. He tapped his pen, looking like he was expecting a pathetic plea for mercy. He gave a sharp, dismissive flick of his wrist. "Go ahead, Miss Sutton. Make it quick." Robert shifted in his seat, a smug grin plastered across his face. He was leaning in, waiting for the show, waiting for me to fail. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a single tear. I slowly reached down to the wooden table in front of me. My fingers, calloused and steady, brushed against the rough surface of a thin, yellow manila folder. It looked like a piece of junk compared to the glossy, leather-bound binders Vance had laid out. But the weight of it felt like lead in my hand. This wasn't a request for pity. It was a weapons system. It was a loaded magazine, and I was about to slide it into the chamber. I undid the string lock on the folder. The sound of the paper sliding was a sharp rasp in the quiet room. I didn't look at the judge. I kept my eyes locked on Arthur Vance. I watched the way his confident posture shifted just a fraction of an inch. He felt it. The change in the air. The shift in the tactical landscape. The man who had spent 3 weeks taking pictures of a waitress was about to find out he'd been stalking a ghost. I pulled the first document from the folder. The paper felt crisp, fresh, and dangerous. "Mr. Vance," I said, my voice cutting through the smug silence like a blade. "You mentioned ambition. You mentioned judgment. Let's talk about what you missed when you were busy following me to the coffee shop." I laid the folder flat on the table, the contents ready to be unleashed. The counterstrike didn't just start, it was already over. They just didn't know they were hit yet. The projector hummed in the stale air of the courtroom, a steady mechanical buzz that filled the silence. I didn't reach for the papers in the manila folder. Not yet. I kept my hand flat on the oak table, feeling the grain of the wood against my palm. I turned my head slowly, pointing a single finger toward the grainy image frozen on the screen. "Mr. Vance," I said. My voice was low, devoid of the shaking they expected. "You worked very hard to pull these images together. You spent a lot of my father's money on surveillance, but your intel team was sloppy, incredibly sloppy." Arthur Vance froze. He had been halfway to his seat, a smug grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. He stopped, his expensive shoes pivoting on the floor. He narrowed his eyes, looking at me like I was a bug he had forgotten to squash. "Sloppy? Miss Sutton, the photos speak for themselves. You are a waitress. You carry trash. You count change." I didn't look at him. I looked at the shadow on the screen. "Look at the angle of the sun, Mr. Vance. Look at the shadows on the pavement. Every single one of them is at a 45-degree tilt. Long, stretching shadows hitting the linoleum at the same sharp angle." Vance's brow furrowed. He looked back at the projector, then at the judge. Judge Miller leaned forward, his heavy robes rustling. He adjusted his glasses, peering at the frozen frame of me holding a black trash bag in a dark alley. "In Boston, in the fall, that angle only happens at one time of day," I continued. My voice was as cold as the tile floor of a barracks. "Between 8 and 11 in the morning, every photo you just showed this court was taken in that exact 3-hour window. Over 3 weeks of surveillance, and you didn't get a single shot of me after noon. Why is that? Robert shifted in his seat. The leather creaked under his weight. He adjusted his Brooks Brothers tie, his fingers fumbling with the silk. He wasn't smirking anymore. He was looking at Vance, waiting for an answer. It's because those hours coincide with my mandatory rest period, I said, my words hitting the room like steady hammer blows. You didn't show the court the rest of my day because the rest of my day didn't fit your narrative. You didn't want a full picture. You wanted a waitress. You built a character frame by frame to convince this court I'm incompetent. This isn't evidence. It is a psychological operation. A character assassination designed to strip me of my grandfather's trust. The silence in the room was thick. I could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the back wall. Vance was sweating now. I saw a bead of moisture roll down his temple, disappearing into his perfectly groomed sideburn. He cleared his throat, but the sound was thin and weak. "You're still a waitress," Vance snapped, his voice rising an octave. He was desperate to claw back the high ground. "That is the truth. You work for $12 an hour. That is your reality." I gave a slow, jagged nod. "It is, but it's not the whole truth." I reached into the manila folder. I didn't rush. I wanted them to feel every second of the slide toward the cliff. "After high school, I didn't go to the parties Robert went to," I said. I didn't call him Dad. He didn't deserve the title. I took out student loans. I worked 3 jobs. I studied law because I value structure. I value systems. I value the clarity of a well-defined rule. Robert's face went a pale, sickly shade of gray. He knew where this was going. He had spent his life dodging rules, and now he was watching me embrace them like armor. "When I got my degree, I didn't head for a corner office at a private firm to make rich men richer," I said. I wanted something harder. I wanted a system where my name didn't matter. I chose the military. I went to officer candidate school. I finally pulled 3 sheets of paper from the folder. They weren't photocopies. They were heavy, high-grade bond paper with a raised official seal that caught the harsh, fluorescent light of the room. I didn't read them. I just held them up, the crisp sound of the paper cutting through the hum of the projector. I walked toward the bench. My stride was measured, my back as straight as a steel rod. I slid the 3 documents across the polished wood toward Judge Miller. "Exhibit A, Exhibit B, Exhibit C," I said. The judge picked up the first sheet. His eyes widened. He looked at the document, then back at me, then down at the paper again. The mired, tired look in his eyes vanished, replaced by a sharp, sudden interest. He flipped to the second page, then the third. Vance was practically vibrating with anxiety. He stepped forward, his hand out. "Your Honor, what is this? I haven't seen these documents. This is an ambush?" Miller didn't even look at him. He was too busy reading. Vance turned back to me, his face twisted in a snarl of pure, petty spite. He was looking for one last way to dig the knife in. He grabbed the edge of the table, leaning in until I could smell the expensive coffee on his breath. "So what?" Vance hissed. "So you went to school. Big deal. You're still making coffee for pennies. You're still a nobody with a tip jar. Making $12 an hour proved one thing, Miss Sutton. Your judgment is absolute garbage." I looked him dead in the eye. I didn't blink. I let the silence hang there, stretching out until it became unbearable. I watched his pupils dilate. I watched the twitch in his jaw. He had just pulled the trigger on a gun that was aimed at his own foot. "Is that your final argument, Mr. Vance?" I asked. My voice was a whisper that felt like a scream. Vance opened his mouth to retort, but the judge's gavel hit the bench with a sound like a gunshot. Vance was still leaning in, his face inches from mine, that ugly, smug heat radiating off him. He was waiting for a breakdown. He was waiting for me to crack and admit that a woman who wipes down linoleum tables for a living has no business touching $11 million. I didn't blink. I didn't lean back. I let the silence stretch until I could smell the sharp, metallic scent of his nervous sweat cutting through the expensive cologne. "Poor judgment," I repeated the words. They tasted like cold iron. I looked past Vance, locking my eyes onto my father. Robert was still reclining, his chest puffed out like a peacock, a man who thought he had finally won. He didn't realize the floor had already been pulled out from under him. He was just waiting for the fall. "Mr. Vance, you understand law, but you clearly don't understand discipline," I said. My voice wasn't a waitress's plea. It was a command. You see a woman in a stained apron and you see failure. You see a low-wage job and you see desperation. That's your first mistake. You assume the uniform defined the soldier. Vance scuffed his shoe, his mouth opening to retort, but I didn't give him the air. I am currently in a transition period, awaiting a permanent change of station. Do you know what that means, Mr. Vance? In the United States military, when you hold a high-level security clearance and you are moving between sensitive assignments, you are under a microscope. Financial transparency isn't a suggestion. It is a cage. I took a step toward Robert. He flinched. Just a fraction of an inch, but I saw it. The first crack in the armor. During this window, I am strictly prohibited from directly managing large influxes of capital. That includes trust funds. That includes inheritance. Any sudden shift in my net worth would trigger a federal review that could stall my career for years. To avoid even the appearance of a conflict of interest, I kept my hands off my grandfather's money. I didn't hide from it. I deferred to the regulations that govern my life. The neighbors in the back row stopped whispering. The air in the room grew heavy, the kind of stillness that precedes a lightning strike. And as for the diner, I let out a short, jagged breath. The colonel didn't give me that money because of a whim. He didn't give it to me because I was his favorite. He gave it to me because I operate with consistency. Under pressure, under surveillance, under the rules. I worked those shifts at the coffee shop to maintain my personal discipline, to keep my mind sharp and my body moving while the bureaucracy caught up with my orders. I don't need a tip jar to survive, Robert. I needed to remind myself that I don't answer to you. I answer to the mission. Robert's mouth was hanging open now. The smugness had vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated confusion. He looked at Vance, but Vance was staring at the floor, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of the mahogany table. The smell of fear was thick now, sour and unmistakable. Judge Miller cleared his throat. It sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. He was still holding the 3 sheets of paper I had slid across the bench. His fingers were shaking, just slightly. He wasn't looking at the neighbors. He wasn't looking at Vance. He was staring at me like he was seeing a ghost. "Ms. Sutton," the judge began. His voice was no longer condescending. It was hesitant, cautious. "I've read these. These are active duty orders, signed by a brigadier general. They list a security clearance level that I've only seen in federal cases." He looked at the papers again, his lips moving silently as he processed the text. He looked up, his eyes wide, the dismissive fatigue from the morning completely gone. "So, in the context of this hearing, who exactly are you?" Miller asked. I stood at a perfect, rigid attention. My chin was up, my shoulders squared. I felt the weight of the colonel's legacy behind me, not as a pile of money, but as a foundation of steel. "I am not just a waitress, Your Honor," I said. The words rang out, bouncing off the oak panels and the high ceiling. "I am a captain in the United States Army. I am a Judge Advocate General's Corps officer, a JAG. I am a licensed attorney with a standing that allows me to prosecute and defend the very laws you sit here to uphold. I operate within a system that holds me legally and morally responsible for the lives of thousands of soldiers. I represent the United States government, not a coffee shop." The silence that followed was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop on the carpet. Robert looked like he had been struck in the solar plexus. He slumped into his leather chair, the Brooks Brothers suit suddenly looking 3 sizes too big for his shrunken frame. "I didn't lead with my rank because this court didn't ask the right questions," I continued, my voice dropping back to that low, lethal hum. "You asked about my wage. You asked about my apron. You never asked about my service. You never asked about the law degree I earned while Robert was busy liquidating his second marriage's assets." Judge Miller stared at me for a long, agonizing moment. He slowly laid the papers down on the bench. He looked over at Vance, who was pale, his eyes darting toward the exit like he was looking for a way to run. The judge picked up his fountain pen. He held it for a second, then his fingers went limp. The pen hit the wooden desk with a sharp, final clack that echoed through the room. "Mr. Vance," the judge said, his voice cold and terrifyingly quiet, "step up to the bench, now." Vance didn't move at first. He looked like he was made of stone. Then, slowly, painfully, he began to walk toward the judge, his head hanging. The swagger of the morning buried under the weight of a truth he never saw coming. I stood my ground. I didn't look at them. I looked at the wall. At the American flag standing in the corner. The battle wasn't over. But the massacre had begun. The recess lasted 10 minutes. It felt like 10 years. When the bailiff called the room back to order, the atmosphere had shifted. The circus was gone. The neighbors, those bored gossips who had come to see the waitress get humiliated, had cleared out, sensing the wind had changed. The air in the oak-paneled room was heavy, cold, and strictly professional. Judge Miller walked back to the bench, his movements deliberate. He didn't look at the clock. He looked at me. There was no more fog of boredom in his eyes. There was a quiet, sharp weight there, a soldier's recognition. "Captain Sutton," he said. The rank hit the room like a drumbeat. Across the table, Vance flinched. Robert sat frozen, his hands buried in his lap. They knew. The tactical map had been torn up and burned. They were no longer fighting a girl in a stained apron. They were fighting the United States Army. But Vance was a cornered rat. And cornered rats bite. He stood up, his face a pale, sickly shade of yellow. He had a dry rattle in his throat, like he had been swallowing sawdust. He started digging through his leather briefcase, the papers crinkling in the silence. He didn't look at the judge. He looked at the floor. "Your Honor," Vance began, his voice cracking before he forced it back into a thin, desperate whine. "Even if we accept the captain's current professional status, we cannot ignore the circumstances of the will's creation. Colonel Sutton was 85 years old. At that age, cognitive decline isn't just a possibility. It is a biological certainty. He was isolated. He was manipulated. We are talking about undue influence. We are talking about a man whose mind was no longer his own." He looked up then, a flicker of greasy hope in his eyes. "We request an immediate stay. We want a full psychological autopsy. We believe the colonel suffered from advanced dementia. He didn't know what he was doing when he signed away $11 million to a granddaughter he barely saw." I felt the heat rise. It wasn't the hot, messy anger of a child. It was the white-hot, focused pressure of a furnace. My breath came out heavy, burning the bridge of my nose. Robert sat there, nodding along to the lie. He was willing to piss on his own father's grave, to call the man who raised him a shell-shocked lunatic, just to get his hands on the vault. The concept of family didn't just break in that moment. It died. It turned to ash. I didn't wait for my cue. I stepped toward the bench, my boots striking the floor with a sound like a hammer. I didn't scream. I didn't have to. The saturating fire was in my eyes. "Colonel Henry Sutton served 31 years in the United States Army," I said. My voice was a low, lethal hum that seemed to vibrate the very wood of the judge's bench. He managed personnel, ammunition counts, and multi-million-dollar logistics in environments that would have snapped a man like you in 48 hours. He reviewed his asset portfolio once a year, every year, until the month he passed. His mind wasn't failing, Mr. Vance. His mind was a precision instrument. He saw the world in spreadsheets and strategy. He knew exactly what he was doing. I leaned in, my shadow falling over Vance's trembling hands. He didn't leave the money to me because I was manipulative. He left it to me because he saw his son trading his honor for Brooks Brothers suits and revolving credit lines. He knew the legacy would be dead within a year if it touched Robert's hands. He chose the only person in this family who actually understands the meaning of a mandate. Vance tried to speak, his mouth working like a fish out of water, but Judge Miller cut him off. The sound of the judge's palm hitting the bench was like a gunshot. Miller leaned over, looking down at Vance with a disgust so thick you could taste it in the air. "This court does not rewrite a veteran's final wishes based on the convenient guesswork of a man who hasn't produced a single shred of medical evidence," Miller said. His voice was cold, final, and heavy with contempt. You've spent the morning trying to paint a picture of incompetence, Mr. Vance, but the only incompetence I've seen today belongs to the prosecution. You haven't proven cognitive decline. You haven't proven undue influence. All you've proven is that greed knows no bottom. The judge picked up the wooden gavel. He held it for a split second, a silhouette of absolute authority against the American flag. The petition to vacate the will and appoint a new executor is denied, Miller barked. The gavel hit the oak block with a deafening crack. The sound echoed off the high ceilings, a final, lethal judgment. Vance slumped. He literally fell back into his chair, his hip catching the edge of the table. Robert just stared at the empty screen of the projector, his face a mask of ruined ambition. Greed can turn a father into a grave robber. If you've ever had to protect someone's legacy from a vulture who should have been family, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to the channel to help me keep the fires of truth burning. Comment honor below if you believe a soldier's word is worth more than a scumbag's greed. I need to know you're with me. I stood there for a moment, the silence of the room ringing in my ears. The legal war was over. The $11 million were safe. But as I looked at the man across the room who called himself my father, I realized the real confrontation hadn't even started. I picked up my manila folder. I didn't look back. I started walking toward the heavy double doors of the courtroom. Robert was already getting up, his face twisting into something ugly and desperate. He wasn't done. But then again, neither was I. The gavel's final crack had died out, leaving a hollow ring. It was over. The $11 million was sitting behind a federal lockbox Robert couldn't pick. The neighbors had scurried away like rats when the lights came on. The bailiff had already disappeared through the heavy side door, his keys jingling. It was just us now. Two people with the same blood and absolutely nothing else left to say. Robert was standing by the defense table, his hands gripping the wood until his knuckles turned white. His suit was wrinkled, his tie hanging sideways. He looked like a man who had been out late at a wake for a friend he didn't even like. He wasn't crying. He didn't have the decency for that. He was just vibrating with a low-frequency resentment. "You didn't have to do that," he said. His voice was thin, reeking of a bruised ego and expensive gin. "No apology. No. I'm sorry I tried to steal your life. Just the petty whining of a narcissist who had lost his audience. You made me look like a fool in front of everyone, in front of the whole town, Julia, my own daughter. You humiliated me." I didn't answer right away. I slowly reached down and picked up my leather briefcase. I checked the latch. Solid. I looked at him, really looked at him, and I didn't see the giant who had haunted my nightmares since the Victorian house in the fog. I saw a small, desperate man who was reaching the end of his credit limit. The man who had once been my world was now just a collection of bad decisions and expensive fabric. "Humiliated you?" I asked. My voice was flat, a sheet of ice over a deep pond. "I didn't say a word that wasn't on a government-stamped document, Robert. I didn't take those pictures. I didn't hire Vance. I didn't lie to a judge. You built this stage yourself. I just let the curtain rise. Today, the bill finally came due." "I was trying to protect the family interest," he snapped, his face turning a blotchy, uneven red. "You're an officer. You don't need the money. You've got a pension coming. I have nothing left." "You have exactly what you built," I said. "Nothing." I stepped around the table. My boots made a slow, deliberate sound on the carpet. I stopped 3 feet from him. I could smell the stale coffee and the sour scent of his failure. I remembered the car door slamming when I was 8, the smell of exhaust, the way the taillights looked as he drove away from the colonel's porch. He had closed the door on me then. "You think this was about money," I said. "It was never about the money. It was about the fact that you thought you could still throw me away. You thought you could treat me like an inconvenience one last time. But the inconveniences have teeth now, Robert, and we don't bark." Robert's eyes darted around the room, looking for a script that ended with him winning. He didn't find one. The silence in the empty courtroom was deafening, a heavy, airless weight that pressed against the oak walls. "I'm still your father," he whispered, a final, pathetic attempt at a guilt trip. "No," I said. "You're just a man I used to know." I turned my back. I didn't wait for a rebuttal. I walked toward the heavy oak doors. I pushed them open. I didn't run. I just kept my pace steady, one foot after the other. Left, right, command presence. I reached the front of the courthouse and leaned my weight against the heavy glass doors. They gave way with a groan of metal and hinges, releasing me from the tomb of the past. The air hit me first. Cold, sharp, reeking of salt and diesel from the Boston harbor. I stood on the top step. The sounds of the city rushed in, cabs honking on Congress Street, the screech of a bus's air brakes, the distant, mournful low of a tanker ship leaving the docks. The city didn't care about the 11 million. It didn't care about Robert Sutton. It just kept moving, a massive machine of steel and steam. I took a breath, a real one. The tumor was gone. I'd spent my life carrying the weight of a family that didn't want me, and in 10 minutes, Judge Miller had performed the surgery. I was light, I was untethered, I was an orphan. But for the first time, it didn't feel like a hole. It felt like a fresh start, a blank map with no borders. My pocket buzzed. It was the sharp, aggressive pulse of my government-issued phone. I reached into my coat and pulled it out. The screen was black, save for a single line of glowing encrypted text. New coordinates received. Deployment window 0400. I stared at the screen. A new mission, a new set of rules. I locked the screen, the black glass reflecting the gray sky in Boston. The legal war was over. The colonel's legacy was safe. My grandfather's money would build schools for veterans, not pay for Robert's BMW. Good. Now what's next? The colonel's voice echoed in my head, dry and gravelly like a boot on a dirt road. I didn't smile, but I felt the corner of my mouth twitch. The mission was complete. I adjusted the collar of my coat, pulled my shoulders back, and stepped down onto the sidewalk. I merged into the crowd of people rushing toward the subway station. I didn't look back at the courthouse. I didn't look back at the shadow of the man inside. I was looking at the horizon. The city was loud, messy, and real. I felt the phone in my pocket, a steady, familiar weight, a new direction. My boots carried me forward into the wind. I wasn't the waitress anymore. I wasn't the victim. I was Captain Julius Sutton. And I had a plane to catch. The door to the Southie rental clicked shut behind me, a thin metallic sound that seemed to echo for minutes in the empty hallway. I didn't reach for the light switch. I didn't need it. The gray anemic glow of a Boston dusk was bleeding through the slats of the crooked blinds, painting long, skeletal stripes across the scarred linoleum floor. The apartment smelled like old wood, pine-scented bleach, and the stagnant air of a place where nobody stayed for long. It was perfect. I moved with the heavy, rhythmic gait of a soldier coming off a 20-hour ruck. I sat on the edge of the twin bed, the springs groaning under my weight. My back was straight, a habit forged in OCS that I couldn't break if I tried. I unlaced my boots. 1, 2. I didn't just kick them off. I placed them side by side against the baseboard, heels touching, toes pointed out, a perfect 90-degree angle to the inch, just like the barracks, just like the colonel's porch. The silence in the room was a physical weight. It was the kind of quiet that made your ears ring, the kind that usually follows a mortar strike. I had been in that silence before, Kandahar, 2018. After the dust from the IED settled and the shouting stopped, there was this same airless gap where the world just seemed to hold its breath. Back then, I was checking my limbs for shrapnel. Today, I was checking my soul for a pulse. I had $11 million sitting in a trust that Robert couldn't touch with a 10-foot pole. I had defended the legacy. I had won the war. But there was no victory lap, no champagne, just a hollow, dry exhaustion that made my bones feel like lead. I stood up and walked to the kitchenette. The counter was already clean, but I grabbed a rag anyway. I scrubbed. Small, tight circles. I focused on a tiny dried water spot near the sink until it vanished. I moved to the stove. I polished the chrome knobs until they reflected the bars of gray light from the window. My hands didn't shake. They were steady, mechanical. This was the drill. If the brain starts to spin, give the hands a mission. At the courthouse, I was a weapon. I was Captain Sutton, a JAG officer with a kill shot in a manila folder. Here, in the dark, I was just a woman realizing she was officially an orphan with a high net worth. I wasn't sad. Sadness implies you lost something you actually had. I hadn't lost a father today. I just finished the long, slow work of burying a ghost. I looked at the small wooden table. A brown envelope was sitting there, its edges frayed from being shoved into my briefcase. I picked it up. The sound of the paper tearing was sharp, like a bone snapping in the quiet room. I pulled out the court order. Robert Sutton. Asset freeze, permanent injunction. I traced the words with my thumb. Robert was done. The Brooks Brothers suits, the country club tabs, the revolving lines of credit, all of it was over. He was out in the cold, and for the first time in 30 years, he couldn't use my name as a skeleton key. I took a sip of water from a plastic cup. It was lukewarm and tasted like the copper pipes of the building. I didn't cry. The colonel didn't raise me to leak. He raised me to hold the point. I sat back down on the bed, staring at the phone on the nightstand. It breathed a pale blue light. Buzz. A low, vibrating hum that rattled the wood. I didn't move. I watched it dance toward the edge. Buzz. I leaned over and looked at the screen. Uncle Mark Sutton, Robert's younger brother. The man who had stayed silent for a decade while I was scraping pennies to pay for law school. He wasn't there when I shipped out. He wasn't there when the colonel was dying in that hospice bed. But he was here now. The vultures had smelled the meat from 3 states away. They'd heard the gavel hit the wood, and they were already circling the perimeter. They didn't want to know if Julia was okay. They didn't want to ask how the burden was doing. They wanted to know if the trust had a loophole. They wanted to know if I remembered that blood is thicker than water. I picked up the phone. The blue light washed over my face, highlighting the hard lines of my jaw. My thumb hovered over the red icon. I didn't hesitate. I didn't feel a flicker of guilt. I slid the bar to the left. The silence rushed back into the room, louder than before. I opened the contact list. I found his name. Block? I didn't stop there. I went through the list. Every Sutton. Every cousin who had ignored my calls when I was 20. Every aunt who had whispered about the waitress at the family reunions. Block, block, block. I was building a new defensive line. This one wasn't made of sandbags and concertina wire. It was made of cold, hard silence. The phone went dark. I laid it face down on the mattress. I walked back to the window and pulled the cord. The gray stripes disappeared, replaced by a solid wall of black. I stood there in the dark for a long time, my hands resting on the cold glass. The city of Boston was moving outside. Cabs hissing on the wet pavement, the distant rumble of the T, the smell of salt and diesel from the harbor. It was a massive, indifferent machine. I wasn't a victim anymore. I wasn't the girl with the broken suitcase. I was the person who held the keys to the fortress. Robert thought he could break me because I was just a waitress. He never realized that the waitress was the one who saw everything. The waitress was the one who learned how to survive on crumbs until she was strong enough to take the whole table. My stomach growled, a sharp physical reminder that I was still human. I went to the fridge. I pulled out a plain turkey sandwich I'd bought at a 7-Eleven on the way home. I sat at the small table and ate it in the dark. It was dry and tasteless, but it was fuel, and I had a lot of work to do. I looked at the manila folder one last time. $11 million. It was a lot of ammunition, and I knew exactly where to aim it. I stood up, walked to the bed, and lay down on top of the covers. I didn't undress. I didn't need to. I closed my eyes and let the silence take me. Tomorrow, the mission would change. But for tonight, the perimeter was secure. The clock on the wall of the diner said 05:30. It was the only thing in the room that wasn't covered in a thin, permanent layer of bacon grease and industrial-strength floor cleaner. Outside, the Boston sky was a bruised purple, the kind of cold morning that makes your lungs ache before you even take a full breath. I didn't go to the place where I worked. I didn't want to see the waitress in the mirror. I went to Mike's, a hole-in-the-wall joint where the coffee was strong enough to peel paint and the regulars didn't ask questions. Mike was behind the counter. He was a mountain of a man. An ex-Marine who'd left half of his left arm in a valley outside Fallujah. The prosthetic was a dull, matte black metal that clicked against the countertop as he wiped it down with a rag that had seen better decades. He didn't smile when I walked in. He just grabbed a ceramic mug and filled it. "Heard you took some heavy fire yesterday, Sutton," Mike said. His voice was a gravelly rasp, the sound of a man who'd shouted over too many Humvee engines. I pulled out a stool. The vinyl was cracked, exposing the yellow foam underneath. "Perimeter held," I said. But the objective evaporated. There's nothing left to defend in that sector. Mike didn't nod. He just turned to the grill. A minute later, a plate hit the counter in front of me. 2 eggs, over easy, 3 strips of bacon, burnt at the edges. Sourdough toast, dry. Exactly how I liked it. No fanfare, no, "I'm sorry for your loss," just fuel. "The news travels fast in this town," Mike said, leaning his good elbow on the counter. The local rag had a blurb. "Army captain defends inheritance." They made it sound like a movie. They didn't mention the part where your old man tried to gut you like a fish in front of a judge. I picked up the fork. My hands were steady. The coffee was hot, the steam hitting my face like a warm slap. "He did what he was built to do, Mike. Robert Sutton doesn't see people. He sees debt and assets. I was a liability that turned into a payout." "Blood's a funny thing," Mike muttered. He reached for a pack of cigarettes in his front pocket, remembered where he was, and shoved them back. "Sometimes it's just a liquid that keeps a heart beating. Doesn't mean the heart's worth a damn. I've seen men in the sandbox bleed out for guys they only knew for 6 months. And I've seen brothers sell each other for a pack of Marlboros. That Sutton blood? It sounds like mustard gas. It just rots everything it touches." I chewed the toast. It was crunchy and tasted like salt. I looked at Mike. He wasn't looking for a thank you. He wasn't looking for an explanation. He was just standing there, a man who knew what it felt like to be abandoned by the system you gave your life to. Robert had spent 30 years telling me I was a burden. He'd dragged me to court to prove I was nothing. And here was a man I'd only known for a year, a guy who barely knew my middle name, pushing a $5 breakfast across the counter because he saw the lines of fatigue around my eyes. The contrast was a jagged piece of glass in my throat. Robert had the DNA, but Mike had the code. Family isn't the name on the birth certificate. It's not the person who shares your nose or your bank account. Family is the person who holds the line when the lights go out. It's the person who asks if you slept, not how much you're worth. I realized then that I wasn't alone. I was just done with the wrong people. I reached for my wallet. My fingers brushed the leather, but Mike's metal arm shot out, pinning my hand to the counter. It wasn't aggressive, it was a lock. "Put it away, Captain," he said. "This one's on the house. Mission success deserves a meal. Now go do whatever it is you people do with $11 million. And for God's sake, get some real sleep." I didn't argue. In the military, you don't argue with the person providing the logistics. I stood up, squared my shoulders, and headed for the door. The Boston air was crisp now, the sun finally breaking over the skyline. It wasn't the vibrant dawn people write about in books. It was a hard, cold light that showed every crack in the pavement. The money was sitting in an account, a massive pile of ammunition. Robert would have used it to buy a Ferrari and a house in the Hamptons. He would have burned it on ego and silk ties. But the colonel didn't leave it to me for a vacation. He left it to me because I knew how to use a weapon. I pulled out my phone. My thumb hovered over the screen. I called an independent wealth management firm. No ties to the Sutton name. No friends of Robert. Just a guy I'd vetted 6 months ago when I first saw the legal storm brewing. "This is Julia Sutton," I said. My voice was a low, steady hum. "The trust is clear. I need to move. Immediately. Set up the 3 accounts we discussed. First, the Veterans Legal Defense Fund. Second, the OCS Scholarship for At-Risk Youth. And third—" I paused, looking at the diner's neon sign flickering in the morning light. "The third one is for a local business. I'm sending you the tax ID now. It's for a man named Mike. No strings, no publicity, just a quiet transfer." I hung up. I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like a commander finalizing a deployment. The $11 million wasn't a prize, it was a legacy. And I was going to make sure that the next soldier who got kicked in the teeth by their own family had a hell of a lot more than a $12 an hour job to fall back on. I walked toward the subway. My boots hit the concrete with a solid, final thud. The war was over. The reconstruction was just beginning. 6 months is a long time in a war. It is a blink of an eye in a life. The sunlight in this office is different from any light I have known before. It is not the sickly yellow of a courtroom or the flickering fluorescent hum of a diner at 4 in the morning. It is clean. It is sharp. It hits the brass nameplate on my desk and throws a glint against the far wall that looks like a spark of static. It does not say trustee. It does not say waitress. It just says who I am. The office is a renovated warehouse in the Seaport District. Exposed brick, concrete floors that stay cold even in the middle of a Boston July. I kept the furniture simple, functional. I do not need leather chairs or mahogany bookcases to feel powerful. I have a steel desk and a high-speed internet connection. That is all the armor I require. I look at the wall behind me. There is only one frame. It is a black and white photograph of Colonel Henry Sutton in 1974. He is standing in front of a jeep in some dust-choked corner of the world, his eyes narrowed against the sun. He looks like a man who just finished a job and is already looking for the next one. There are no pictures of Robert. I took every image I had of the man who shared my DNA, and I burned them in a galvanized trash can behind the diner. The Sutton legacy was rewritten with a sharp blade. The vultures have been purged from the family tree. Every now and then, I hear things through the grapevine. Uncle Mark's wife still likes to gossip when she thinks I am not listening. Robert had to sell the Victorian house, the one with the fog and the ghosts of all the women he let down. He's living in a one-bedroom apartment in a part of Quincy where the sirens never stop, and the trash on the sidewalk is the only scenery. He spends his days at the local bars, telling anyone who will listen that I am a cold-blooded bitch. He calls me an ungrateful daughter who stole his father's hard-earned money. I do not send him letters. I do not send him checks. I do not send him anything at all. People think revenge is about blood and fire. It is not. Real revenge is about becoming a ghost. Robert Sutton craves attention like a starving man craves bread. By ignoring him, I have starved him out. In my world, he is statistically irrelevant. He's a zero on a balance sheet. He's a ghost in his own life, and the hardest part for him is realizing that I stopped haunting him a long time ago. I reach for the heavy metal embosser on the corner of my desk. Clack. The seal bites into the paper with a satisfying, mechanical snap. It is a legal filing for a specialist out of Fort Campbell. His mother had drained his savings account while he was deployed in Eastern Europe. She had used his power of attorney to buy a boat and a new kitchen. It is the same old story. Same old vultures, different zip codes. I signed my name at the bottom of the page. Captain Julia Sutton, retired. My handwriting is a series of jagged, precise lines. I think about Arthur Vance and his expensive silk ties. I think about his sneering questions about my judgment. I am using the Colonel's $11 million as ammunition. I am building a fortress for people who do not have a manila folder of their own. Every veteran who walks through my door is another round I am firing back at the people who think they can prey on the disciplined. The phone on my desk does not buzz with creditors anymore. It rings with purpose. I spend my mornings on the phone with independent wealth managers and my afternoons in the trenches of the legal system. The money is not a prize. It is a weapons system. It is a scholarship for a kid who wants to go to officer candidate school but cannot afford the gas money. It is a legal defense fund for a soldier whose family tried to rob him while he was protecting theirs. A knock comes at the door. It is Sarah, my assistant. She was a waitress at a diner 2 blocks away until I hired her 3 months ago. She knows how to read a room. She knows when to speak and when to stay quiet. She does not call me boss. She calls me captain. The next one is here, Sarah says. Her voice is steady. A kid from the 10th Mountain Division. His family is trying to take his house while he is recovering at Walter Reed. I stand up. I feel the fabric of my vest. It is straight. No wrinkles. No stains. I walk over to the window and look out at the harbor. The water is gray and restless, but the horizon is clear. I can see the ships moving out to sea, following their own coordinates. I look at the photograph of the colonel one last time. He's still looking at me with those hard, knowing eyes. The mission has changed, but the objective remains the same. Protect the line, hold the point. Tell him to come in, I say. I turn toward the door. I am not a victim. I am not a child waiting for a father to come home. I am the self-made dawn in a world that tried to keep me in the dark. My boots hit the concrete floor with a solid, final thud.